The winter of 874 after Christ arrived like a predator testing its prey. In the Norwegian highlands, somewhere between the coastal fjords and the inland valleys where even summer struggles to warm the ground, 32 warriors of Bjorn Ironside's warband made a decision that would echo through centuries. They chose to march through what appeared to be gentle snowfall, the kind that drifts down like ash from distant fires, soft and forgiving. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 2 hours. Modern meteorologists call this phenomenon a temperature inversion collapse. The Vikings had no such clinical term. They called it the breath of the ice giants, and they were right to fear it. When the cold descended that evening, it came with such ferocity that men who stopped to adjust their boots never stood again. Their fingers froze to the leather straps, their breath crystallized in their beards and sealed their mouths shut. By dawn, only 11 men emerged from hastily excavated snow caves, tunneled with swords and bare hands into drifts that had become salvation rather than tomb. The other 21 lay frozen in formations that would puzzle travelers for generations, some in fighting stances, weapons drawn against an enemy that had no body to strike. Others huddled together in circles, their final warmth insufficient against the mathematics of heat loss. The locals would call these formations the Army of Ice, and parents would bring children to see them each spring when the melt revealed the dead, using the sight to teach respect for winter's sovereignty. But here is what the sagas don't tell us: what happened in those 2 hours between gentle snowfall and mass death. The surviving 11 men, in the years that followed, spoke of something more terrifying than cold. They described a silence so complete that their heartbeats became deafening. They spoke of how sound itself seemed to freeze, how a man shouting stood 10 paces away yet made no noise that could reach them. Several swore they saw shapes moving in the storm, figures too tall to be human, though whether these were hallucinations from oxygen-starved brains or something else entirely, the records leave frustratingly blank. What is documented carved in runes on a memorial stone that still stands in Hordaland is that this catastrophe sparked a revolution in Viking survival architecture. The master builder Thorvald Stormcrow lost 3 sons that night. The historical record shows he was 41 years old, a wealthy man who could have spent his remaining years in comfort. Instead, he dedicated 15 years to a singular obsession, understanding how to survive what had killed his children. Thorvald did something unprecedented. He studied bears. The chronicles record that he spent entire winters observing where bears chose to den, measuring the angles of their caves, noting how they positioned entrances relative to prevailing winds. His neighbors thought him mad, this grieving father who crawled into abandoned bear dens with measuring ropes and marking stones. But Thorvald understood something profound: that survival architecture already existed in nature, perfected through millennia of trial and error more brutal than any human testing. His revolutionary design, which he called the Earth Lodge, incorporated what he learned from those years in the wilderness. The entrance descended at a precise angle 15 degrees below horizontal before rising again into the main chamber. This created a cold trap, a pocket where frigid air settled while warm air remained in the living space above. The smoke from cooking fires rose naturally but couldn't escape quickly enough to steal precious heat, instead circulating through the space before gradually venting through carefully positioned holes in the roof. But here is what makes Thorvald's design truly remarkable, what modern engineers find almost impossible to believe. He achieved this without mathematics as we understand them. The Vikings had no concept of thermal dynamics, no understanding of convection currents or heat transfer coefficients, yet Thorvald's earth lodges maintained internal temperatures that precisely matched the optimal range for human survival, cold enough to prevent dangerous carbon monoxide buildup from fires, warm enough to prevent hypothermia during sleep. The records suggest he built 43 prototypes. Most failed in various ways. Roofs collapsed under snow weight, ventilation systems allowed heat to escape too rapidly, or entrances flooded during spring melt. 7 of his test structures killed the men sleeping inside them, deaths that Thorvald apparently recorded in detailed diagrams that have since been lost to time. What survived were his final designs, perfect in their simplicity and effectiveness. Women transformed his work. Astrid the Wise, a name that appears in 3 separate saga accounts, always with the honorific the Wise attached, saw what Thorvald had missed. His single-layer walls, while effective, could be improved. She introduced multiple-layer construction using materials that seemed absurd to the warriors. Woven branches, mud mixed with animal hair, and turf cut in specific thicknesses. The chronicles are maddeningly vague about Astrid herself. Was she Thorvald's wife, his daughter, a rival builder? The texts don't say. What they do record is that her triple-layer wall design created insulation superior to stone construction at a fraction of the weight. The air trapped between layers provided thermal resistance that modern testing has measured as equivalent to 6 inches of contemporary fiberglass insulation. From this foundation emerged 7 distinct shelter designs, each solving a specific deadly problem. The simplest remained the snow cave, nothing more than a cavity carved into a drift, requiring only a sword to dig and perhaps an hour of hard labor. But even this basic shelter incorporated crucial knowledge. The entrance had to be lower than the sleeping platform, the roof needed to be arched to prevent collapse, and critically, a small ventilation hole had to be maintained near the highest point, even if it seemed counterintuitive to punch a hole in your shelter during a blizzard. Vikings died learning these lessons. The sagas record instances of entire families found suffocated in snow caves, where someone had sealed the entrance too completely, or where drifting snow had blocked ventilation without anyone noticing until it was too late. The ice house represented the next level of sophistication, a structure built from blocks of ice or hard-packed snow, shaped like a dome with an entrance tunnel. These could house 10 men for a week and withstand winds that would shred traditional tents. Construction took a crew of 4 men, approximately 6 hours, provided the snow had the right consistency. Too fresh, and it wouldn't hold shape. Too old, and it became brittle, cracking under its own weight. Hidden longhouses solved a different problem entirely. These were underground structures large enough to conceal 50 warriors through an entire winter, invisible from the surface except to those who knew what to look for. The entrance might be disguised as a natural rock formation or hidden beneath a seemingly abandoned woodpile. Inside, these complexes could include sleeping chambers, storage areas, and even small forges where smiths could work by carefully ventilated fires. Mountain dugouts, forest shelters, and portable storm tents each filled specific niches in the survival spectrum. The dugout offered protection when caught above the tree line, carved directly into mountainsides, with strategic rock overhangs providing initial shelter. Forest shelters utilized standing trees as structural supports, wrapping them with layered walls of branches and sod. Storm tents, the most portable option, consisted of treated leather stretched over collapsible frames, able to be erected in minutes but offering only minimal protection against extreme cold. When Harald Hardrada's men tested these designs during the brutal winter of 891, the results validated everything Thorvald and his successors had built. Groups using traditional canvas tents and hoping to tough out the weather suffered catastrophic losses, 70% casualties across 12 warbands. Those employing the new methods lost only 1 man in 10, and most of those deaths came from accidents or illness unrelated to shelter failure. But here is what the military records don't explain: why some shelters failed when they should have succeeded. 3 separate accounts describe well-built earth lodges that killed everyone inside despite perfect construction. The bodies showed no signs of suffocation, freezing, or smoke inhalation. They simply lay in their sleeping positions as if they had chosen not to wake. The survivors who discovered these scenes reported feelings of profound unease, a sense that something had visited these places during the long dark. The Vikings attributed such deaths to spirits, to angry Landvatir land spirits who rejected human presence in their territory. The sagas record elaborate blessing rituals developed to appease these entities, ceremonies involving blood offerings and carved runes. Whether these rituals actually prevented further mysterious deaths, or whether the unexplained casualties were simply statistical anomalies lost to poor record-keeping, we cannot know. What we do know is that within 2 generations of the Army of Ice disaster, Vikings had transformed winter from their greatest enemy into a strategic advantage. The knowledge spread through deliberate teaching and brutal practical experience, becoming as fundamental to Viking identity as shipbuilding or combat skills. These 7 designs, born from catastrophe and refined through sacrifice, would enable an expansion that changed the face of medieval Europe. The ice that killed 21 men in 874 had taught the survivors something the temperate world could never understand: that winter was not a season to be endured, but a landscape to be mastered, one shelter at a time. Between 900 and 1050 Anno Domini, Viking expansions succeeded not through superior weapons or fiercer warriors, but through mastering something their enemies considered impossible: winter positioning. While Christian kingdoms huddled behind walls waiting for spring campaigns, Norse raiders moved freely through frozen landscapes, appearing where no army should exist and vanishing like ghosts into terrain their pursuers feared to enter. The legendary raid on Paris in 845, after Christ demonstrated this advantage with devastating clarity, Ragnar's sons Ivar, Bjorn, and Sigurd brought 120 ships up the Seine in March, when defenders expected safety. But the chronicles reveal something more sophisticated than simple audacity. Prior reconnaissance teams had spent the previous winter establishing 17 hidden shelters along the river valley, each positioned to support specific tactical objectives. These weren't crude camping sites. They were strategic installations, some concealed for 2 years before the main assault, stocked with preserved food, cached weapons, and detailed intelligence about local defences. The shelter network allowed Viking forces to strike even in January, when Frankish commanders assumed frozen rivers and impassable roads provided natural protection. Each shelter type served precise strategic purposes that transformed Vikings from raiders into something more dangerous, a persistent occupying presence that could appear anywhere, anytime. Snow caves housed scouts watching Roman roads that crisscrossed Gaul, 2 men rotating shifts in cramped spaces barely large enough to lie down. These observers tracked troop movements, merchant caravans, and seasonal patterns of guard rotations, sending information back through relay systems that moved faster than any messenger the Franks possessed. Earth lodges became supply caches, buried so completely that locals might walk over them daily without suspicion. Inside these underground chambers, Vikings stored everything needed to sustain raiders who traveled light and fast: salted fish, dried meat, replacement weapons, extra clothing, and most crucially, detailed maps carved into wooden tablets showing roads, bridges, and the locations of other shelters in the network. Concealed longhouses staged the large-scale operations that terrified medieval Europe. A 100-man raid didn't materialize from nowhere. It assembled over weeks in underground complexes located days from the target, with warriors arriving in small groups that attracted no attention. These staging bases included training areas where men drilled in silence, learning to coordinate attacks without verbal commands that might be overheard by hunters or travelers who wandered too close. The economic genius of this system lay in construction efficiency that seems almost impossible given the tools available. A 10-man crew working in good conditions could excavate and complete an emergency snow cave in 2 hours fast enough to save lives when weather turned deadly without warning. An earth lodge, properly constructed with the layered walls that Astrid the Wise had pioneered, required 2 days of intensive labour by the same crew. A permanent underground longhouse, capable of hiding 50 warriors, took 2 weeks, but used only materials found within walking distance of the site. This speed fundamentally changed military calculations. Traditional armies needed supply lines, baggage trains, and fortified bases that took months to establish. Vikings could create operational infrastructure in the time it took their enemies to mobilize a response. By the time Frankish troops arrived to investigate reports of Norse presence, the raiders had either struck and withdrawn or simply disappeared into shelters so well hidden that search parties passed within feet without detection. In Iceland, Ingolf Arnarsson's settlers discovered the full potential of combining all 7 shelter types into integrated defensive systems. The winter of 874, the same year that produced the Army of Ice disaster in Norway, nearly destroyed the first Icelandic colony. 70 settlers landed in August, expecting to build traditional homes before winter. The volcanic soil defeated them. Ground that looked solid turned to mud under construction, and timber proved scarcer than expected. When the first snows arrived in October, they had completed only 3 permanent structures. Ingolf made a decision that saved the colony. Rather than trying to crowd everyone into inadequate housing, he organized construction of a defensive ring using all 7 shelter designs, each positioned to leverage natural features while supporting the others. The Landnamabok, the Book of Settlements, records this arrangement with unusual specificity, suggesting it became a template for later colonization efforts. The Thorson family, experienced mountain hunters, excavated dugouts into hillsides above the settlement, creating observation posts that provided early warning of approaching storms and a last refuge if coastal shelters flooded during spring melt. The Ericssons, who came from coastal Norway, where earth lodges had become common, supervised construction of 3 large underground complexes near the shore, positioned to house livestock as well as people. Between these anchoring positions, smaller shelters filled every niche in the defensive ring. Snow caves provided quick refuge for hunters caught out during sudden weather changes. Forest shelters near the tree line offered intermediate staging points for gathering expeditions. Ice houses, rebuilt several times through the winter as storms damaged earlier versions, served as communal gathering spaces where families could socialize without depleting the warmth reserves of sleeping chambers. The system worked. All 70 settlers survived that first winter, though the Landnamabok acknowledges 3 deaths, 2 from illness that predated landfall, and 1 from an accident involving a panicked horse. More remarkably, the colony actually expanded its operational range during winter months, with hunting parties traveling days from the main settlement, because the shelter network allowed them to work safely in conditions that would have been suicidal otherwise. This integrated approach spread across Viking territories through deliberate knowledge transfer that historians have only recently begun to appreciate. Young warriors didn't just learn combat skills. They spent entire winters apprenticed to master builders, with successful shelter construction required for earning full warrior status. The training was systematized to a degree unusual for the period, with specific competencies that had to be demonstrated before instructors would certify a man as qualified. A warrior needed to prove he could build an emergency snow cave literally blindfolded within 3 hours, working entirely by touch and spatial reasoning. This wasn't sadistic ritual. Men caught in blizzards often couldn't see their own hands, and survival depended on muscle memory and understanding snow's properties through touch alone. The test killed several apprentices each generation, usually through roof collapses that instructors couldn't prevent in time. The Vikings accepted these casualties as the price of maintaining standards that kept the larger population alive. Earth lodge construction required demonstrating knowledge of soil types, drainage patterns, and structural engineering that wouldn't be formally codified in European architecture for centuries. Apprentices learned to read landscapes the way sailors read, stars understanding how water moved underground, where permafrost lurked beneath deceptive surfaces, and which slopes would shed snow loads versus which would accumulate deadly weight. The knowledge became so valuable that it transformed into currency more precious than silver. Irish kings, desperate to defend against year-round Viking raids, paid enormous ransoms not for captives, but for Norse engineers who could teach their forces winter survival. The annals record that Brian Boru spent 12,000 cattle, an astronomical sum, to hire a master builder named Orm Frostbeard, who spent 5 years training Irish warriors in shelter construction, before vanishing back to Scandinavia with wealth that made him a jarl. Byzantine emperors recruited even more aggressively. The Varangian Guard wasn't just elite fighters sworn to protect the emperor. It included specialized engineering units tasked with adapting Norse winter survival techniques to different climates. Byzantine records describe experiments modifying earth lodge designs for the dry soils around Constantinople, incorporating Viking ventilation principles into siege warfare, and developing hybrid shelters that combined Norse ingenuity with Roman engineering principles. But here is what the military chronicles don't fully explain: why Byzantine commanders insisted these shelter designs remain classified at the highest levels of imperial security. Standard construction techniques were shared freely with Allied forces. The Viking methods were different. Engineers who taught them to unauthorized personnel faced execution, and several recorded instances describe Varangian warriors killing their own comrades to prevent shelter knowledge from spreading to potential enemies. The spiritual dimension remained inseparable from practical construction throughout this expansion period. Every shelter required blessing rituals that went far beyond simple prayer. Specific runes had to be carved into support beams before they could be set in place, not decorative symbols, but functional elements that builders believed were as essential as physical structure. The most common was Algiz, the elk's edge rune representing protection, carved at the highest point of every shelter, where it could catch the attention of protective spirits. Thor's hammer symbols appeared at entrances without exception, positioned so that every person entering or leaving passed beneath the god's protection. But here is what the sagas don't specify: were these hammers always carved in the same orientation? Some surviving examples point downward, as if striking the earth. Others point upward, as if challenging the sky. Scholars have proposed elaborate theological explanations for this variation. The simpler truth, suggested by a few fragmentary sources, is that different regions developed different traditions, and no one knew which was correct because the knowledge supposedly came from the gods themselves, whose intentions remained deliberately mysterious. Women performed ceremonies using juniper smoke to purify completed shelters before occupation. The rituals occurred at specific times, never during full moon, always before sunrise, and required participants to fast for a day beforehand. What modern observers often miss is that these weren't superstitious performances disconnecting from practical concerns. The juniper smoke actually functioned as a mild antiseptic and insect repellent, while the ritualized inspection that accompanied blessing ceremonies created opportunities to identify structural flaws before they became fatal. The archaeological evidence reveals something that historical texts often obscure: that women weren't just performing religious duties but exercising quality control over construction that male builders had to respect. Several runic inscriptions record instances of priestesses refusing to bless shelters they deemed unsafe, effectively halting occupation until problems were corrected. The fact that warriors accepted these judgments suggests women's spiritual authority translated into practical power that shaped Viking survival architecture at fundamental levels. By 1000 Anno Domini, a network of approximately 10,000 shelters stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, creating an invisible empire that existed in parallel with conquered territories. Each shelter bore secret symbols cut on nearby trees, arrangements of stones that looked natural to outsiders, or marks on rock faces that only Vikings trained in the marking system could interpret. These signs indicated shelter type, capacity, current occupancy status, and sometimes warnings about local dangers or hostile populations. The marking system itself remains partially mysterious. Some symbols have been decoded through comparison with runic inscriptions and saga descriptions. Others resist interpretation entirely, suggesting either regional variations that died with their creators or deliberate encryption to prevent enemies from learning the code. What's clear is that the system worked with remarkable reliability across vast distances and many generations, maintaining coherence despite having no central authority to enforce standardization. This network represented more than military infrastructure. It embodied a worldview that saw winter not as nature's punishment but as strategic opportunity, a landscape that could be mastered, mapped, and weaponized against enemies who feared what Vikings had learned to control. The shelters that began as desperate survival measures had evolved into the architectural foundation of an empire built on ice and darkness, hidden in plain sight across the frozen reaches of the medieval world. The medieval warm period ended around 1100 Anno Domini with a climatic shift so abrupt that chroniclers struggled to describe it in terms their readers would believe. Winters that had been merely harsh became lethal. Springs arrived weeks late. Summers barely qualified as such. In 1114, the Baltic Sea froze solid enough that merchants drove wagon trains across ice from Denmark to Sweden, a phenomenon that hadn't occurred in living memory and wouldn't happen again for centuries. The 7 shelter designs that had served Vikings adequately during the warm period suddenly faced conditions they hadn't been built to withstand. Temperatures dropped so severely that traditional earth lodges became death traps when the ground froze to such depths that roots holding soil together shattered, causing catastrophic collapses. Snow caves that once provided reliable emergency shelter now required constant maintenance as repeated freeze-thaw cycles created ice layers that could cut through leather and flesh with equal ease. The Vikings evolved or died. The innovations that emerged during this crisis period represent some of the most sophisticated cold-weather architecture developed before modern insulation technology, achievements that contemporary engineers find almost impossible to replicate using period-appropriate tools and materials. The Great Storm of 1196 tested everything. Earl Rongvald of Orkney, leading a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, had stopped in Norway to visit relatives when weather reports suggested deteriorating conditions. He delayed departure by a week, then another week. By the third week, snow had closed all passes through the mountains, trapping Rogvald with approximately 200 people, his own retinue, extended family members, household servants, and unlucky travellers who had sought shelter at the same estate. The chronicles preserved by Rognvald's Skald describe what happened next with unusual precision, suggesting the Earl understood he was witnessing something historically significant. The main longhouse could barely accommodate 80 people, and crowding everyone inside would have depleted oxygen and created conditions perfect for disease. Transmission. Rognvald made a radical decision based on old knowledge that most Vikings had abandoned. He ordered construction of underground complexes that would connect multiple shelter types into a single integrated survival system. 3 large underground longhouses went up first, positioned in a triangle around the main estate. But rather than leaving these as isolated structures, Rongvald's engineers excavated tunnels connecting each to the others and to the surface longhouse. The engineering challenges were substantial. The tunnels had to descend below frost depth approximately 6 feet in that region, then maintain level grades to prevent water accumulation while providing sufficient headroom for people carrying supplies. They survived 40 days. The storm that trapped them wasn't a single weather event but a series of systems that stalled over Scandinavia, dumping snow that accumulated to depths exceeding 20 feet in exposed areas. The tunnel network allowed the trapped population to move between shelters without surface exposure, distributing people and resources according to need rather than being locked into whatever random allocation existed when the storm hit. But here is what makes this survival story truly remarkable. The complex evolved beyond mere shelter into a functioning underground village. Blacksmiths maintained forges in one of the longhouses, using ventilation shafts that drew fresh air while exhausting smoke and fumes. The mathematical precision required to balance these airflows without either suffocating workers or allowing dangerous heat loss defies easy explanation, yet they achieved it through trial and error, guided by principles they couldn't formally articulate. Women established weaving workshops in another chamber, producing clothing from wool supplied by sheep they had brought underground when the storm's severity became apparent. The sagas mention this almost casually, that they brought livestock into the live shelters, but the engineering implications are staggering. Animals produce heat, consume oxygen, and generate waste. Housing them underground required solving problems of ventilation, sanitation, and space allocation that shouldn't have been possible with Viking-era technology. The ventilation system they improvised became legendary among master builders. Using hollow tree trunks as air pipes, they created a network that brought fresh air into the deepest chambers while allowing stale air to escape. The pipes had to be precisely angled, too steep and snow would slide in, too shallow and air wouldn't circulate. They had to extend above the deepest expected snow accumulation while remaining sturdy enough to resist the crushing weight of drifts that could exceed 15 feet. Several of these air pipes failed during the 40-day ordeal. The chronicles describe frantic repairs conducted in blizzard conditions, with men rope-tied to prevent them being blown off the surface while they cleared blocked pipes or reinforced damaged sections. 3 men died during these repair efforts, lost in whiteout conditions despite being tethered to the longhouse. Their bodies weren't recovered until spring melt revealed them frozen less than 50 feet from safety, pointing toward shelter they could no longer see. Master builder Magnus the Deep revolutionized Earth Lodge construction in response to the crisis winters that followed the medieval warm period's end. Magnus had survived the Great Storm as a young apprentice in Rognvald's party, and the experience shaped his subsequent career. He spent 30 years refining shelter designs, testing innovations that sometimes failed catastrophically, but occasionally produced breakthroughs that saved thousands of lives. His revolutionary double-walled chamber design emerged from studying how wealthy merchants stored goods requiring temperature stability. The concept was simple: create two walls with an air gap between them, but implementation proved devilishly complex. The gap had to be wide enough to provide insulation, but narrow enough to prevent convection currents that would transfer heat outward. Magnus experimented with gaps ranging from 2 inches to 2 feet, before determining that 8 inches provided optimal performance. The inner wall used traditional woven branches and mud construction. The outer wall employed thicker timber covered with multiple layers of turf. Between them, Magnus packed dried grass, harvested at specific times of year when moisture content was minimal. This grass layer provided insulation that modern testing has measured as remarkably effective, maintaining inside temperatures of approximately 60 degrees Fahrenheit, even when outside temperatures reached -40. But here is what the construction manuals don't fully explain. Why did some double-walled earth lodges perform spectacularly, while others failed despite seemingly identical construction? Magnus's own notes, preserved in fragmentary form at the University of Oslo, suggest he suspected variables beyond human control. He describes shelters built on what appeared to be identical sites, using materials from the same sources, by crews of equal skill. Some maintained stable temperatures through the worst conditions. Others developed cold spots that no amount of additional insulation could eliminate, as if the earth itself rejected the structure above it. Magnus attributed these failures to land spirits and developed elaborate site selection rituals, meant to identify locations where spirits would tolerate human construction. Modern geologists have proposed more prosaic explanations involving underground water flows, variations in soil composition, or thermal properties of bedrock. Neither explanation is entirely satisfactory. The pattern of failures doesn't correlate neatly with geological features, yet the spiritual explanation requires accepting forces that leave no physical evidence. Magnus's daughter, Gudrun Magnusdottir, improved her father's designs in ways that challenge assumptions about medieval women's roles. The sagas typically mention her in passing, usually in context of marriage alliances or religious devotion. But building contracts preserved in Danish archives tell a different story. Gudrun supervised construction projects across Scandinavia, commanded crews of male workers, and received payment equal to master shipwrights. Her innovation involved incorporating steam chambers into earth lodge designs, serving dual purposes of warmth and ritual cleansing. The chambers used heated stones over which water was poured, creating steam that could raise temperatures while providing therapeutic benefits that Vikings valued. But Gudrun's genius lay in integrating these steam chambers into the overall heating system rather than treating them as separate luxury features. The steam chambers sat at the lowest point of her earth lodges, heated by fires that also warmed the main living spaces above. As steam rose through carefully designed vents, it carried heat throughout the structure, while moisture condensed on walls in controlled patterns that Gudrun shaped through strategic placement of absorbent materials. The result was a shelter that maintained optimal humidity levels dry enough to prevent mold and rot, moist enough to prevent the respiratory problems that plagued traditional shelters where air became desiccated by constant fires. The Greenland colonies demonstrated ultimate adaptation to conditions that exceeded anything mainland Scandinavia experienced. Eric the Red's descendants, isolated from regular contact with Europe after around 1100 Anno Domini, modified all 7 shelter types for permafrost conditions that made traditional construction impossible. They couldn't dig deep earth lodges when ground remained frozen solid year-round below minimal depths. They couldn't rely on timber frame construction when trees didn't exist. They couldn't stockpile conventional fuel when wood was scarce and peat insufficient for long winters. Their solutions merged Viking techniques with Inuit knowledge in ways that produced genuine innovations rather than simple cultural borrowing. The hybrid shelters they developed combined Norse understanding of ventilation and heat management with Arctic peoples' expertise in ice construction and seal oil lamp technology. These weren't crude compromises but sophisticated designs that leveraged strengths of both traditions while minimizing weaknesses. The multifamily complexes that emerged in Greenland represent perhaps the pinnacle of Viking cold-weather architecture. These structures housed 800 or more people through winters lasting 8 months, creating self-contained communities that maintained social cohesion and economic productivity despite conditions that would seem to permit only bare survival. Underground passages connected livestock barns, storage chambers, workshops, and communal halls, where skalds performed the long cycles of traditional sagas by seal oil lamplight that cast shadows. The listeners swore, sometimes moved independently of the flames. The economic networks supporting shelter construction evolved into sophisticated industries that scholars are only now beginning to fully appreciate. Specialized tool makers produced groundbreaking spades with distinctive curved blades that modern archaeological excavations can identify from fragments. The metallurgy involved in these tools was remarkably advanced. The blades needed to be hard enough to penetrate frozen soil without shattering, yet flexible enough to withstand the leverage forces applied during excavation. Rope makers created specific weaves needed for binding roof beams, with different patterns for different shelter types. The ropes weren't merely strong, they had to maintain flexibility in extreme cold when most natural fibers became brittle. Manufacturing processes involved treating fibers with animal fats and plant oils in proportions that rope makers guarded as trade secrets worth more than the products themselves. Professional shelter builders commanded fees equal to master shipwrights, traveling between settlements to oversee construction of critical winter refuges. These master builders maintained quality standards through a guild system, unusual for the period and region. Apprentices trained for minimum terms of 7 years longer than most medieval craft apprenticeships before being certified as journeymen. Achieving master status required demonstrating innovations that advanced the craft, not merely replicating existing techniques. But here is what the economic records don't reveal. Why did certain master builders refuse to work in specific regions despite generous payment offers? Several documented cases describe builders who traveled hundreds of miles to accept commissions, yet declined more lucrative contracts in areas that appeared to offer no unusual challenges. When pressed, these builders offered vague explanations about poor site conditions or unsuitable materials. A few spoke more candidly about locations that felt wrong, where the land itself seemed hostile to human shelter. The survivors of this great freezing period passed down knowledge encoded not just in construction techniques, but in stories that modern readers often dismiss as superstition. The tales of shelters that kept their occupants alive while nearby structures failed inexplicably. The accounts of underground chambers where people heard sounds, footsteps, voices, breathing despite being alone. The warnings about certain geographical features that should be avoided when selecting shelter sites, with explanations involving spirits and ancient curses rather than soil mechanics. Whether these stories represent garbled transmission of practical knowledge or preserve genuine mysteries that resist rational explanation, they served essential functions in Viking society. They created redundancy in survival knowledge, ensuring that critical information reached people who might not grasp technical details but could remember a dramatic story. And they maintained humility among builders who might otherwise become overconfident, reminding them that mastery of shelter construction didn't guarantee survival in landscapes that operated according to rules humans couldn't fully comprehend or control. The 1792 discovery shocked everyone involved. Norwegian explorers searching for remnants of the lost Greenland colonies found something impossible: Viking shelters preserved so perfectly they appeared abandoned yesterday rather than centuries ago. Inside structures dating to around 1200, Anno Domini lay wooden bowls still stacked on shelves, iron tools showing minimal rust, children's toys carved from walrus ivory, and most remarkably, the skeletal remains of families arranged as if sleeping peacefully in their beds. The preservation resulted from specific atmospheric conditions in Greenland's interior valleys where these shelters existed. Extreme cold and aridity created natural mummification, while structures buried under advancing ice remained sealed from oxygen and moisture. When 18th-century explorers excavated these time capsules, they found construction details that contradicted everything they thought they knew about medieval technology. The wooden beams showed no signs of the crude tool marks expected from Viking-era construction. Instead, joints fit together with precision that suggested advanced understanding of wood properties and structural engineering. Ventilation systems incorporated baffles and dampers that could be adjusted to control airflow with sophistication matching contemporary European architecture. The shelters contained primitive thermometers, glass tubes partially filled with colored liquid, suggesting Vikings monitored and managed internal temperatures with scientific rigor historians had assumed didn't exist before the Renaissance. But here is what disturbed the explorers more than impressive engineering: the question of why these perfectly functional shelters had been abandoned. The remains inside showed no signs of violence, starvation, or disease. People appeared to have simply lain down and not awakened. Several families had young children positioned between parents in protective arrangements that suggested the adults knew what was coming and tried to shield the vulnerable. Yet nothing in the archaeological record explained what had killed them. The Norwegian government classified the findings for 20 years, releasing limited information that sparked more questions than answers. When details finally became public in 1812, they coincided with renewed European interest in Arctic exploration, creating immediate practical applications for knowledge locked away for centuries. Fridtjof Nansen studied the Greenland discoveries obsessively before his 1895 polar expedition. His journals, published after his return, describe adapting Viking snow cave techniques with modifications for conditions more extreme than Norsemen had encountered. Nansen's party survived temperatures that killed members of previous expeditions, largely because they understood principles the Vikings had mastered, that survival depended not on fighting cold, but on cooperating with it. Nansen's modifications were subtle but crucial. Viking snow caves typically included single-entrance designs that trapped warm air effectively but created dangerous situations if drifting snow blocked the opening. Nansen insisted on dual-entrance systems, with one exit remaining accessible regardless of wind direction. This innovation saved his party during a storm that buried their primary entrance under 12 feet of snow in 4 hours. They simply excavated the secondary exit and continued operations, while weather that would have trapped and killed others became a minor inconvenience. Roald Amundsen took Viking shelter knowledge even further. His successful 1911 South Pole expedition succeeded where Robert Scott's British party failed catastrophically, with the difference largely attributable to shelter strategy. Scott used heavy canvas tents that required significant effort to erect and provided minimal insulation. Amundsen employed designs directly derived from Norse earth lodges and ice houses, adapted for Antarctic conditions but fundamentally unchanged from structures built 1,000 years earlier. Amundsen's journals credit his childhood in Norway, where elderly relatives taught him traditional shelter construction as part of normal education. Skills that educated Europeans dismissed as primitive folk knowledge allowed Amundsen to reach the pole and return safely, while Scott's technologically superior expedition perished. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Modern science and equipment couldn't match knowledge accumulated through centuries of trial, error, and death in frozen landscapes. The 21st century has witnessed remarkable vindication of Viking methods in contexts their creators couldn't have imagined. Norwegian special forces train exclusively in traditional shelter construction, considering it more essential than weapons proficiency for Arctic operations. Their survival rates in extreme conditions exceed 98%, a statistical achievement that makes them the most cold-weather-capable military unit in the world. The training program is punishing. Recruits spend 3 months learning nothing but shelter construction, repeatedly building and testing structures under conditions designed to reveal flaws before they become fatal. The course includes 48-hour survival exercises, where teams must construct functional shelters in complete darkness during active blizzards, using only hand, tools, and materials they can gather from immediate surroundings. Failure rates approach 40%, with most candidates eliminated not for lack of physical toughness, but for insufficient attention to details that separate adequate shelters from ones that actually keep people alive. Military officials refuse to fully disclose training specifics, citing operational security concerns. What's known is that Norwegian special forces can establish concealed winter bases in 72 hours that remain undetectable to satellite surveillance and can support 12-man teams indefinitely. These capabilities directly trace to Viking shelter designs that were optimized for exactly these requirements: rapid construction, complete concealment, and sustained occupation under hostile conditions. The 2019 avalanche rescue demonstrated Viking knowledge in civilian contexts. 14 hikers became trapped when a massive snowslide buried a mountain trail in northern Norway. Standard rescue protocols suggested the group had perhaps 4 hours before hypothermia caused casualties, assuming anyone survived the initial impact. Rescue teams faced conditions that made helicopter evacuation impossible and ground approach dangerous due to ongoing avalanche risk. One hiker, a 63-year-old grandmother named Astrid Johansson, remembered stories her grandmother had told about Viking emergency shelters. Using only ski poles and gloved hands, she directed the group to excavate a snow cave design essentially unchanged since 800 Anno Domini. The structure they built incorporated every crucial element Vikings had learned through lethal trial and error: entrance below sleeping platform, arched roof to distribute weight, small ventilation hole at the highest point, and strategic positioning relative to wind direction. The rescue team reached them 18 hours after the avalanche. All 14 hikers were alive, tired and cold, but showing no signs of serious hypothermia, despite outside temperatures that had dropped to -25 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills approaching -50. The shelter's internal temperature, measured during extraction, was 38 degrees, cold enough to be uncomfortable but warm enough to prevent death. Astrid's knowledge, passed through generations of women telling stories to children, had saved 14 lives, using techniques Viking warriors would have recognized immediately. Climate researchers studying the preserved Greenland sites have made discoveries that challenge assumptions about modern building technology. Viking underground longhouses maintained internal temperatures more stable than modern prefabricated Arctic research stations, despite using zero external energy for heating. The structures leveraged thermal mass of surrounding Earth, strategic positioning relative to solar exposure, and ventilation systems that captured and redistributed heat with efficiency approaching 80%, a figure contemporary green building designers struggle to match even with advanced materials and computer modeling. The mathematical precision surprises engineers accustomed to assuming medieval builders worked through intuition rather than calculation. Roof angles optimized for maximum snow load without collapse match values that modern engineering would derive through calculus and materials science. Dimensions of chambers relative to expected occupancy correlate perfectly with oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production rates that Vikings supposedly couldn't measure. Entrance tunnels descend and rise at angles that create natural air circulation, precisely matching convection patterns that 19th-century physicists would formalize as fluid dynamics principles. Some researchers suggest Vikings possessed more sophisticated mathematical knowledge than historical records indicate, possibly preserved through oral traditions that left no written trace. Others propose that centuries of experimentation created empirical knowledge that happened to match theoretical principles Europeans wouldn't formalize for hundreds of years. Neither explanation is entirely satisfying. The precision seems too consistent for pure trial and error, yet no evidence exists of underlying mathematical frameworks that would have enabled calculated design. But here is what disturbs some researchers examining the Greenland site's anomalies that resist straightforward explanation. Several underground complexes contain chambers whose purpose remains unclear. These rooms connect to main living spaces, but show no signs of occupation or storage use. Some feature unusual acoustic properties that cause voices to echo strangely, or sounds to seem to originate from incorrect directions. Others contain markings that don't match any known runic system, arranged in patterns that suggest intentional design rather than random decoration. One chamber discovered in 2008 contains what appears to be a map carved into stone flooring, showing land masses that don't correspond to any known Viking exploration routes. Some formations might represent Greenland and Iceland, but other features seem to depict coastlines or islands that don't exist or don't exist anymore. Researchers debate whether this represents imaginative mythology, distorted geographical knowledge, or something else entirely. The map bears precise latitude and longitude lines, a navigational sophistication Vikings aren't supposed to have possessed, yet the lines are there, carved deeply into rock, undeniably real. Modern applications of Viking shelter principles extend well beyond military and survival contexts. Sustainable architects incorporate earth lodge concepts into eco-homes throughout Scandinavia and increasingly in North America. These structures use traditional thermal mass principles, strategic positioning, and natural ventilation to achieve heating requirements, 80% below conventional construction. Several have operated for decades with no external heating systems, maintaining comfortable internal temperatures through Scandinavian winters where ambient temperatures regularly drop below 0 Fahrenheit. Disaster relief organizations now teach simplified versions of the 7 shelter designs to refugee populations facing winter conditions in temporary camps. The techniques require no specialized materials or tools, making them ideal for situations where resources are desperately limited. Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Afghan families in Pakistan, and displaced populations throughout East Africa have received training in snow cave construction, earth lodge excavation, and emergency shelter design derived directly from Viking innovations. The results have been mixed but occasionally dramatic. Some communities embraced the techniques enthusiastically, integrating them with local building traditions to create hybrid designs optimized for specific regional conditions. Others struggled with cultural resistance to living underground or skepticism about methods associated with a distant civilization they'd never heard of. The most successful implementations occurred when trainers presented the knowledge without historical context, simply as effective solutions to immediate problems rather than exotic foreign technology. The Danish military maintains detailed manuals covering all 7 shelter types, classified at levels typically reserved for weapons systems and electronic warfare capabilities. This classification isn't paranoid secrecy, but recognition that shelter knowledge represents strategic advantage in Arctic regions, where climate change and melting ice caps are creating new theaters of potential conflict. Nations capable of operating effectively in extreme cold possess military options that others simply don't have, making winter survival knowledge a component of national security. Military analysts studying Arctic warfare scenarios consistently emphasize that victory in frozen environments depends less on weapons technology than on ability to exist and operate when enemies cannot. The nation that masters winter shelter that can move troops, establish bases, and conduct operations year-round, in conditions others find prohibitive controls territory, regardless of nominal sovereignty or international agreements. This reality makes Viking shelter knowledge relevant to 21st century geopolitics in ways that would have seemed absurd 2 decades ago. Even luxury wilderness tourism has embraced Viking shelter experiences, though in sanitized forms that would amuse warriors who bet their lives on these designs. High-end resorts in Norway, Iceland, and northern Canada offer nights in reproduced earth lodges or ice houses, complete with Wi-Fi, gourmet meals, and heated sleeping bags. Guests pay hundreds of euros for the privilege of experiencing a carefully controlled version of conditions that killed Vikings regularly, marveling at authentic details while insulated from authentic danger. The deepest lesson of Viking shelter knowledge, the principle that contemporary society most needs yet most resists, is that survival means cooperation with nature rather than domination of it. Vikings didn't defeat winter through technological superiority. They survived by understanding cold's properties so thoroughly they could leverage rather than fight natural forces. Their shelters worked with snow's insulating properties, with Earth's thermal mass, with wind patterns and solar exposure, creating designs that succeeded precisely because they accepted nature's rules rather than trying to impose human preferences. This philosophy, encoded in construction techniques passed through 40 generations, offers wisdom increasingly relevant as extreme weather events multiply across a climate system pushed far from historical norms. The modern world faces a paradox: global warming. that simultaneously produces local freezing as disrupted atmospheric patterns drive Arctic air into populated regions unprepared for extreme cold. In this strange new climate, knowledge born from Viking necessity might prove as essential to 21st century survival as it was to 9th century raiders learning to master winter's deadly embrace. The shelters remain, buried under Greenland ice and scattered across landscapes from Newfoundland to Russia, silent testimony to human ingenuity born from desperation. Some will survive another 1,000 years, others melt into landscapes they once made survivable. All of them whisper the same message to anyone willing to listen, that winter is not humanity's enemy, but humanity's teacher, patient and merciless, waiting to instruct those humble enough to learn from darkness, cold, and the ancient wisdom written in ice.